Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here for our discussion on abortion, charting a path forward. My name is Michelle Storms. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm the executive director at the ACLU of Washington. So I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. Our office for the ACLU of Washington in downtown Seattle sits on the unceded territory of the Duwamish people, and our work throughout Washington spans many indigenous territories, and we acknowledge all First Peoples of our region who have and continue to steward this land since time immemorial. We express gratitude as guests and thank the original and current stewards of this land. And I want to encourage you to learn more about the land you're on, and we're providing a link in the chat to find out more. And at the same time, I also will share a powerful animation on the scale and the severity of land loss, which is quite serious and was quite intentional, related to Indigenous erasure. It's not just about a place to live, it is intrinsically linked to the loss of culture, language, and traditional ways of being. So again, please take a look at the link in the chat. So as we do our work, all of us, right, against white supremacy and settler colonialism, we must always remember the role that this country played in the forced removal of lands, cultures, and languages, and recognize the ways in which we perpetuate colonization even today, and even as we work to repair past harms. So I'm sure that you appreciate that a land acknowledgement by itself. It's just a starting point for both learning where we are and what we need to do, and also what action we need to take in terms of creating repair. So we have to demonstrate that we understand and are willing to do the work that's necessary to make this country truly fair and just. Now, as I go on to get into our topic at hand, I want to remind you that if you have questions throughout the event, you can use the question and answer box. And also after the event, we're going to send you a list of links and resources that we will have mentioned throughout the talk. So let's get into it. Right, tonight, we're going to talk about the future of abortion. And as you're very well aware, earlier this year, the United States Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, holding that there is no federal constitutional right to an abortion in this country. And this ruling has devastating and far-reaching impacts that land disproportionately on the people who've always faced systemic barriers to care, communities of color, the LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit Plus community, undocumented immigrants, young people, those living in rural communities, people with disabilities, and people with low incomes. And while we don't have time to go into the full history, the record shows us that it's not just a disproportionate impact, it's a targeted impact. These communities have been targeted. Abortion laws throughout history have been laden with sexism and racism. One simple agreement would be the Hyde Amendment, for example, which limits government-funded abortion. But who gets government-funded abortions? People who don't have money. And in this country, people with money, regardless of what the state of the law was, people with money always have and always will get abortion care. That's before Roe and after Roe. So this ruling is a strain on us collectively and individually, and we have to acknowledge it. Just to step back and grapple with the enormity of this, people in the United States lost a fundamental right with the overruling of Roe versus Wade. This is a right that the people in the United States have held for 49 years. And it's an inherently stressful time and devastating time for many of us. There are those who are disproportionately impacted, as I've mentioned, who are going to suffer directly from forced pregnancies. And then there are those on the ground fighting for the rights of all of us. That's abortion advocates and activists and providers, healthcare providers. There are people who have spent their entire lives fighting around this issue of bodily autonomy and reproductive justice and freedom in our bodies. So we know that many, including folks on our panel tonight, are working overtime to continue this fight despite the rollback. Now, also to provide a little bit of context for what this ruling has meant in practical terms. So as of today, the New York Times has reported that 13 states have implemented complete abortion bans. 5 states have severely restricted access, and 8 states have blocked attempted bans, which means that abortion remains legal for now. Anti-abortion politicians have made it clear they're not going to stop with overturning Roe. They want to work to ban abortion nationwide. Furthermore, gender-affirming care was already under attack in many states across the country before the Dobbs decision. The fall of Roe has emboldened these efforts. So while abortion and gender-affirming care remain legal in Washington state, there is much work to be done to secure access to both abortion and gender-affirming care in Washington for everyone who will need it, including those who are forced to travel to states like ours for care, because it's one thing to have a right, but you also have to have access. So we'll continue to do all we can to ensure access to services, break down barriers, including advocating for adequate funding, breaking down barriers to care, and protecting those who provide healthcare services, because abortion care is healthcare, and those seeking and helping others receive abortion and gender-affirming healthcare services. Tonight, we're going to learn from our allies about the future of abortion and what we each can do to support access in such a perilous time. So before I dive in, I want to thank each of our event co-sponsors for collaborating on tonight's program. That's the Cedar River Clinics, the Gender Justice League, Legal Voice, Northwest Health Law Advocates, Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates Washington, Pro-Choice Washington, and the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. I thank these partners who are vital to our work and without whom we couldn't get to where we are, and we'll keep fighting together. I'm so grateful. You can learn more about each of these wonderful organizations by checking out the links in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. I'm really proud of this group of people who have been working so hard in this community, and they're all treasures. I'll start with Maru Mora Villalpando. Maru Mora Villalpando is a community organizer and an immigrant. She was born and raised in Mexico City. Since she was very young in Mexico, she was involved in protests and marches and supporting work stoppages or strikes. In the United States, she spent more than 2 decades working for racial justice and immigrant rights. She's the founder of La Resistencia. The group's main focus is to end all detentions and deportations and to shut down the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. Maru is also a founding member of Mi Gente, a national digital organizing Latinx group. Unlike many other immigrants, she's been an outspoken organizer and has been upfront about staying in the United States as an undocumented immigrant for over 2 decades. Due to her work against immigration and customs enforcement, the agency has put her in deportation proceedings in 2017. But despite these challenges, Maru, her family, and her community remained undeterred and continued their community work. And in September 2021, Maru was granted prosecutorial discretion by the same agency that tried to deport her. And with this recent win, Maru continues the work to end all detentions and deportations in Washington state, where she lives. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Danny Eschini. Danny is one of the founders and the current co-executive director for Gender Justice League, a trans justice organization based in Seattle and Washington, D.C. They have served for nearly half a decade on various Washington state reproductive justice coalitions, working to pass the Washington Reproductive Parity Act, the Gender Affirming Treatment Act, and has worked in nearly a dozen states supporting trans justice and reproductive justice organizations, working at the intersections of trans identities, gender affirming care, and reproductive rights. Danny currently splits time between Washington, D.C. and Seattle. We're also thrilled to have Councilmember Morales joining us. Councilmember Tammy J. Morales was elected to the Seattle City Council in 2019. As an experienced community organizer and advocate, Morales worked for the Rainier Beach Action Coalition and served as a Seattle Human Rights Commissioner. Morales is trained as a community and regional planner and has spent her career working with frontline communities on local issues, including food security, displacement in low-income neighborhoods, and community-centered development. Morales previously served as a legislative director for a state representative in Texas, as a city budget analyst in New York, and ran a successful consulting firm on food access research and programming with clients such as the City of Seattle and King County. Morales has been a Seattle resident for over 20 years, a mom with 3 kids, 2 in the Seattle public school system, and a proud Viking at Portland State. I'm also delighted to have Courtney Normand joining us. Courtney serves as the Washington State Director for Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates. As the state director, Courtney directs field, communications policy, and electoral efforts to promote, protect, and advance access to sexual health, education, and reproductive rights in Washington. In this role, Courtney has successfully led Planned Parenthood's effort to pass proactive legislation such as the Affirm Washington Abortion Access Act, Reproductive Parity Act, 12 months of birth control, confidentiality in insurance communications, and Washington's new comprehensive sex education law, all while defending against federal attacks on the Affordable Care Act and on Planned Parenthood. She served as campaign co-manager of the victorious 2020 ballot measure campaign to approve Referendum 90 and protect sex education. Courtney serves on the steering committee of Our Votes Count, a coalition of progressive organizations working to engage new and low propensity voters in elections to secure the margin of victory in state legislative races. And prior to joining the team at Planned Parenthood in 2008, Courtney earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology, minor in women's studies, Master of Arts degree in policy studies at the University of Washington. And her research on low-income single mothers, welfare reform, and childcare subsidies was published in the UW-Bothell Policy Journal in 2007. She was also honored with Campaign Heroine Awards from the National Women's Political Caucus of Washington in 2012, 2020, and 2021. Next, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jennifer Chin. Dr. Chin is a Seattle native who attended undergraduate at UC Berkeley and majored in public health, minored in global poverty and practice, then took a year off to work as a case manager at Project Access Northwest, a local nonprofit that connects low-income, uninsured patients to specialty medical care. She completed medical school at Tulane, OBGYN residency at University of Hawaii, and recently graduated from the Complex Family Planning Fellowship here at UW. She is currently an assistant professor in the Division of Complex Family Planning in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, where she splits her time between University of Washington hospitals and clinics and Cedar River Clinic. Last but not least is my colleague, Leah Rutman. Leah is our Healthcare and Liberty Counsel at the ACLU of Washington. In this role, she works to expand and protect health access, rights, and equity. Prior to coming to ACLU in 2013, Leah practiced commercial litigation at a law firm and worked and volunteered at various human rights organizations. Leah is a graduate of McGill University and Columbia University School of Law. Now, these folks are brilliant, as you can see, and they have a lot to share with you, so let's get into it. Now, I'm going to start with Dr. Chin, as you're a provider, and there's a lot of heat on providers, and so I'm curious to know from you, what are the changes that you've seen in the provision of abortion care since the fall of Dobbs? And if there's any examples you can share, have you seen an increase in patients coming from out of state?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I am honored to be on this panel with everyone here. In answer to your question, I think nationally we are seeing major shifts in abortion care and in the types of patients who are seeking abortion care. Overall, we know that ever since the fall of Roe, patients are having to travel much further for necessary health care, including abortion care. People are also needing to travel at much later gestational ages because there are so many logistical and financial barriers to receiving timely medically necessary care. We're also seeing that patients who are becoming pregnant are more complex medically and are sicker in general, again, because of a lack of access to basic necessary health care that creates many pre-existing conditions and makes them even more dangerous when they do become pregnant. And overall, we are seeing an increase in patients needing to travel out of state in order to obtain abortion care. This is really dangerous for many, many patients if they are not able to access abortion care and family planning services in healthcare clinics or locations that are close to them, because this creates so many barriers that do not need to exist and make care much more complicated.
Thank you for sharing that. So you're emphasizing what we've been learning, that the stresses and strains on the system, right, are growing, and the experiences of the patients who are seeking care are becoming more complex. Councilmember Morales, you've been a staunch leader on abortion rights, and you've actually also shared your own abortion story publicly. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share your personal connection to abortion with us tonight and tell us why you think it's so important to uplift people's abortion experiences.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for inviting me to join the discussion. I would say first that I've never been ashamed to tell my story, but it was really only recently in the last couple of years that I felt the need to actually share it. Never really felt the need to share it either. So I had an abortion when I was recently graduated from college. I was waiting tables. I had no health care, no savings. I was on the pill, but it was finals week and I missed it a few times. And importantly, I was waiting to find out if I had been accepted into graduate school. So I knew that I was really in no position to become a parent, either financially or emotionally, certainly not when I felt like I was about to start down my career path, which at the time I thought was going to be an academic career. That changed. But so I decided to have an abortion, and I made an appointment at Planned Parenthood. I will say that this was in Texas. This was in the early 90s. So long before Wendy Davis took the Senate floor for her filibuster, this was a time when the Christian right and the Republican Party were becoming virtually the same thing. Operation Rescue was organizing people to, block the entrance to abortion clinics. That wasn't my experience, thankfully, but there were folks, harassing and screaming at me from behind barriers in the parking lot as I went in. So, I decided to start opening up about my experience because I think it's important that people know there are lots of reasons why people make the decision to seek abortion care. I'm sharing the reasons that I made the decision because so much of the broader conversation, especially what we're hearing right now, is about exceptions, right? So we'll restrict abortions for you, except in the case that you were a victim. If you want to have an abortion for any other reason, you're out of luck. And the truth is that I shouldn't have to give a reason. I had a medical issue. I had a legal procedure to address my issue. And I made the decision that really would make the rest of my life better because of the educational opportunities and the economic opportunities that I could take because I didn't have a child to take care of. So, part of the reason I think it's important to share is because whether it's financial or emotional or a medical issue, it doesn't really matter why I had an abortion because it's really none of your business. It's not the business of politicians or church leaders or school boards or anyone else. It's between a pregnant person and their doctor, and that really should be the end of it. And so I'm hoping that as we really move through this very tough time that we're going to be in for a while, people recognize that this is a medical procedure and it really should stay between the person who is seeking the care and their provider, and that's the goal.
I so appreciate your story, Councilmember Morales, because you're exactly right. It is about each person's health and decision and the advising of their doctor and your future, not someone else's. So I'm grateful to you for putting it in that context, because it's not just the exceptions, it's life and it's healthcare. So much appreciation for that. Maru, if I may turn to you, you've been doing work in the digital and privacy sphere, and I was hoping you might talk a little bit about how our data can be used by the government and private entities to learn about our health and how it can be used in harmful ways in our country, especially in light of the criminalization of abortion and gender affirming care across the country.
Yes, and also thank you for inviting me to this space. This is a very important conversation for us in the immigrant justice movement because we have been pushed to learn how technology is being used against us. Technology is so normalized nowadays. Almost everyone has a phone. People use it all the time. They even have it next to their beds when they go to bed. It's just such a tool, right, that we all are so familiar with, and we have no idea how our data that is produced when we interact with each other through phones or just being outside on the public, that data is being gathered and is being sold and is being shared. So for us, we learned that local law enforcement have all the tools and more than that they need to gather data. So, for example, there's those devices on the streets when you're driving and it says slow down, the maximum speed is 30, right? And I found them useful. I was like, oh yeah, it reminds me to slow down. Well, actually, those devices can also gather your data. They can read your license plates and your location. There's cameras everywhere nowadays when we're outside in public. That is also data that is being gathered about you, your face recognition, and your location. There's also data that is being gathered by, for example, prisons and private immigration centers, where through phones, when you call your loved one in detention or in prison, your voice data is also being gathered. And there's, once all that data is being gathered, so what happened to it? Well, there's data that we don't even think that is being gathered through devices. There's data that is being gathered through companies. Your insurance company, like your car insurance company, your electric bill, almost everything is for sale. So I want to give you an example. When the Trump administration began deportation proceedings against me, they actually, ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, bought from a company my data. So they went and say, hey, tell me everything you have on Maru. And there were pages and pages and pages about where I've lived, all the different insurance companies I had. Like, it's just ridiculous to think all the access that they can have. And recently, for example, it turns out that Facebook was giving health data to private companies that they were buying through the interactions in social media. So as all this data is being gathered, it's being sold either by private companies or it's being shared by local law enforcement. So again, none of this is known to the public, but most importantly, it's not being regulated. And that's the biggest problem that we see, that anybody with money can not only buy data, but they can also buy devices to start finding where people are at. You know, if somebody is close to a health clinic, they can set up a device and find out, okay, who's coming and who's going. There's just so much, and I know it's scary, but we must know, we need to know, because it's not right that technology that should be not only friendly to us, should not be a danger to us. And so that is why it's so important to learn how data is being gathered, but most importantly, why can we regulate the gathering of data and how data is being accessed? I think that's the most important thing, because nowadays technology keeps growing, it keeps going really fast, and I don't think we're keeping track and up to date on how both private companies and law enforcement are working together to learn way too much about us.
Thank you for that. And, so all of what you have just described, it's all true. It is all happening. And in this context now, where we have many states criminalizing abortion, this issue of you left your state to come to a different state, and now your data is telling that you were at a Planned Parenthood, it really brings it into stark relief what the dangers are. And it's why we are fighting so hard, along with Mi Gente and others, to get better laws passed on our data privacy, right? It's quite critical. Danny, from your perspective, right? So since Roe fell, everyone's been talking about abortion bans, but well before the Dobbs case, gender affirming care has been under attack. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the gender affirming bans and the restrictions you're seeing across the country, because these things are very related.
Yeah, so we've seen several states already pass bills, particularly targeted at gender affirming care access for young people. So it's under the guise of protecting children. And ironically, it's targeting parents who are also supporting transgender and gender questioning youth. And states like Alabama and Arkansas already have bans in place that, much like abortion bans, criminalize doctors who provide gender affirming care. Both of those are being challenged in court, but they rely on the same constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, that Dobbs called into question, and rely on many of the same legal arguments. So we're not really entirely certain how the federal courts will treat the questions that are raised by those two laws. Florida is currently in the process of banning gender affirming care for young people. And we know that there are pre-filed bills in Montana and Texas, in several other states as well. We think Idaho is going to have a bill. We've already heard rumblings there, so just right next door to us in Washington State. And most of these bills criminalize providers, but also criminalize parents. So Texas went the incredibly extreme step of involving Child Protective Services and calling the provision of gender affirming care child abuse, and started open investigations into parents, which is, if you look under the statutory definition of genocide, removing children from a community, taking them out of the custody of their parents in order to prevent that family from allowing that child to be a young person. It is a component. We have a horrible history in the United States of targeting children, removing them from their communities in order to prevent parents from affirming the gender identity of their children. And certainly we've seen, I know of at least 7 families who have traveled from either Texas, Alabama, or Arkansas to Washington State, who have come here in part because of our more affirming laws and because we have access to care at Seattle Children's Hospital. And I think Vice News just did a story last night looking at a family that traveled from Texas to Connecticut. And so there is this internal displacement that is happening of families, where families are being forced to choose stay in Texas and potentially be investigated and have children taken away, taken out of their custody, or leave everything that they've known, their family, their friends, their jobs, their homes, their lives, and travel to a state where they might not know anybody in order to get care. So there's huge crossovers, and it's the same, underpinning idea that the legislatures know better than families and parents about the healthcare of these young people, including the doctors. And most young people are seeing a therapist, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, and possibly an endocrinologist. Usually there's 4 or 5, sometimes 6 medical providers that are involved in the care of this young person, but somehow legislators in these states who've never met these young people seem to think they know best. So we're seeing it, and I think we'll see more, especially as we get into the presidential campaign. We are really concerned that much has happened in 2004 with the DOMA bans. I think it was 30 states passed DOMA bans in 2004 as a strategy to reelect George W. Bush. We're really concerned that we'll see similar constitutional amendments or referendums on the ballot in the next presidential election in 2 years as a way to sort of drive voters and use fear tactics to drive votes. So we're seeing it spreading very far. Yeah.
Right. So I'm hearing an echo here from something that we heard earlier from Councilmember Morales, right, about the decision between an individual or the family or the parents, right, and the healthcare provider being interfered with for political reasons that don't have anything to do with the health of the person or persons involved. So, and also the use of fear tactics, which I think has been, unfortunately, a very successful tactic that's been put into place. Courtney, so working with an organization that provides abortion care in Washington State, Planned Parenthood, they face unique challenges in this new environment. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what the organization is experiencing on the ground and what you're doing.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. As you said at the start of this talk tonight, we are really in an unprecedented public health crisis in the wake of the Supreme Court decision. We expect that the abortion bans and restrictions happening elsewhere in the country are going to leave about 35 million women and people who can become pregnant with nowhere to turn in their state if they need abortion care. We have been getting calls from patients from all over the country. Before the Dobbs decision, we kind of were operating off of an assumption that we'd be seeing people mostly from our neighboring states, just where people could be probably just factoring in, you know, what's the shortest drive for me. But the reality that people are experiencing is that the states neighboring their own may be already booked out several weeks for appointments, and so they have to go quite a bit further. So people are relying more on their personal networks, or maybe even where they can find the most affordable air flight. And many of them are finding their way to us here in Washington. Our providers are sharing with us that patients are scared, they're angry, and they're worried about their privacy and their safety when they go back home to their home state. And sometimes they're not comfortable even telling us what their home state is, and they're really just concerned about what might happen if that were to be revealed. We've also gotten reports about so-called crisis pregnancy centers giving out misleading information about abortion, which they have been doing for decades, but also taking extra steps to mislead people about their pregnancies. And that's been resulting in folks having to seek abortion care when they'd actually been deceived about the fact that they were pregnant at all. The abortion care safety net in Washington has already been going through some crises. We had about a decade of stagnant reimbursement rates for Medicaid care, and of course then the COVID pandemic, and now Roe. So as you can imagine, nonprofit healthcare safety net providers are struggling to make sure that we can keep everything running and don't turn anyone away. So providers like Planned Parenthood and Cedar River clinics have been seeing about a 20% increase in patient demand so far. We still are continuing to collect that data, and it can vary across our state, but we certainly are seeing an increase of people coming to us. We already have a pretty significant vacancy rate when it comes to our workforce. You know, we're hearing about healthcare providers across the state and the workforce issues that are at play. There are some extra concerns for the abortion provider safety net because we're trying to compete with really big health entities as an employer. So while folks are passionate about working at places like this, we're also trying to keep up with, you know, a large hospital that could offer a $10,000 signing bonus, significant loan repayment, retention offers, and all these recruitment incentives. So we are just trying to keep up. And another issue that many entities don't always have to consider in the healthcare field is security. We are uniquely impacted alongside our gender affirming care providers to have to take some extra steps to protect our patients and providers. And so those costs also can impact our ability to be sustainable and keep our work going for folks. But with all of that being said, we do have a lot of encouragement, and we do take a great amount of hope, knowing that in Washington, this is a place where we can do something about this and we can be helpers to the people who need us. We're certainly going to do everything we can to make sure that Washington can always be a place people go for the care that they need.
I really appreciate that. And I think that's a part of the mission, right, of Planned Parenthood that really shines through. And Dr. Chin, because you're also in the provider space, I wonder if there are any additional concerns or challenges that you would add to that from the perspective of Washington State providers. And you're aligned with a large research hospital as well as with clinic systems. What are you seeing?
Thank you for that question. I think from a national and state perspective, we're also worried about our trainees. Many of our learners, including medical students and OBGYN and family medicine residents, as well as other healthcare professionals, are very interested in being able to provide abortion services and family planning care. However, for a lot of people who are either already working in states where abortion is no longer allowed or will be moving to states for their further training where abortion is no longer allowed, this is becoming a major issue where many people who have always been interested in being able to provide this care and very much want to be able to learn those skills won't be able to just because of the location that they're traveling to. And so when we think about the future of family planning and the future of reproductive health care, this is another very strong impact that will negatively affect people who desperately need this type of care. And unfortunately, as with many healthcare disparities, this will impact people who are already marginalized and already face multiple barriers to receiving any type of healthcare, particularly abortion care.
Thank you for the work you're doing to try to increase and to do that training and to make it possible for people to live out their careers and do so safely. It's really challenging right now. Maru, I want to come back to you and two things, because I have a great audience question that I also want to share with you. So I was going to ask you about some of the special risks that are faced by immigrant communities, especially related to the data privacy abuses that you brought up before. And I want you to say a little bit more about that. And related, there was a question that came about, are there safe messaging applications that are safer for advocates to use when they are supporting patients or immigrant families or so on? So, you know, Signal is out there as an example, but what else might be out there that in the social media or technology realm that is more useful for people to use and more protective, if at all?
Right. Let me start with that. Social media is not private. Definitely it's not. I get a lot of people messaging us in our different platforms that we use for social media. And I always remind them, this is not a private messaging application. So definitely Signal is one that seems to be right now the best one. There's not 100% guarantee, but it's at least one that we trust a little bit more in. If people have money to donate to Signal, please do. We don't. And we believe that those that have the money should help us sustain that kind of application. Well, you know, as we're talking and mentioning the efforts in Washington to protect our communities, definitely the issue of traveling, it has been already a problem for immigrant communities, undocumented immigrant communities, because most states don't provide driver's licenses for people without Social Security numbers. We do in Washington, and we do because we fought. So let's remind ourselves that all these wins that we have in Washington is because we, the people, we fought for them. Nobody just came and say, hey, you know, we want to be nice to you and we're going to give you these rights and this kind of level of high quality life that you deserve. No, it becomes because it's the struggle that we have been part of for many, many, many years. And so as we think about immigrants that need to travel, first of all, without a driver's license, and second, that they're coming from states where they could be criminalized just by the fact of having to access reproductive health care, it's already putting in danger that person, if that person is undocumented, or even if they are a legal permanent resident, but the act of traveling or the act of searching for this healthcare could produce a charge against them. And so let me just do a quick Immigration 101. For immigration federal law, it doesn't match the kind of charges that we have at a state level. So if in the state somebody charges you with a misdemeanor, to them, to the feds, it could mean aggravated felony, whatever that means. So they make up these weird definitions just to excuse our criminalization, right? So ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, they make up anything they can to excuse our detention and our deportation. And now knowing that it is a crime in many places, in many states, to search for reproductive health care, it puts a double jeopardy on immigrant communities. And so we know that there are immigrant communities that are trying to reach places like Washington. But again, if they don't have a driver's license or just the fact of traveling and searching for that healthcare access, it's double the problem and the risk for those communities. And if you add to it that their data is being gathered, and let's say that nobody knows that this person is searching for that kind of healthcare access, but somebody actually is gathering data of the location where they're going, that will be enough to trigger a charge and therefore a deportation proceeding. So this is extremely dangerous for immigrant communities, like I said, not only undocumented, but even for those like me that now have a green card, but yet we're not fully US citizens. So remember, the US laws discriminate against us because of our immigration status. So just without, I think it's very important to remind ourselves that there's an extra risk for our communities, and that as we fight to keep Washington safe haven, a sanctuary, we need to expand that and make sure that immigrant communities are not suffering double jeopardy here because of their right to have reproductive healthcare access.
Thank you. Spot on. I really appreciate that. So, Danny, I'm going to come back to you and ask this. What are the impacts of gender-affirming care bans that you see, and what can Washington do to help protect gender-affirming care providers, seekers, and helpers?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of different impacts. So I think I talked a little bit about the fact that people are having to leave or seek care in states that, similar to abortion care, that they're not from. They have less social network, less support, and are trying to navigate a very complex process. Like I also am a person who received gender-affirming care as a teenager back in the 90s. If you can imagine, people act like this is, very new and radical. Well, like I was in foster care in Maine in the late 90s, and my caseworker had to drive me to Boston Children's Hospital, where I received care as a teenager. And so, that was the closest. It was a 3.5-hour drive. We had to go at least twice a month in order for me to get blood work and to get follow-up. And one of the other things that we're seeing is specific targeting. So Boston Children's was targeted with bomb threats. They've had 13 bomb threats in the last 2 months. There have been, and I think Seattle Children's Hospital also had a bomb threat recently. There have been this huge escalation of very real violence and very real targeting of programs by the far right. And so that's another sort of like abortion providers, Courtney was saying, a lot of concern about the safety of patients and parents and people's identities being revealed. We also saw the Colorado Springs shooting that happened recently. And I think within the community, there's an immense amount of fear and anxiety that just accessing care could mean people have a target painted on their backs. So here in Washington State, one of the things that we are thinking a lot about is shield laws that would protect people, or refugee laws that would protect people coming to Washington State to receive care, that would prevent the state of Washington or, other state actors in Washington State from facilitating criminal investigations in other states. So not, participating in trying to seek medical records or, facilitating fugitive retrievals, et cetera, if people come, and also shielding medical providers if they've had actions taken against them from a state like Alabama, that they could come to Washington State and still have a medical license in Washington State, and that their medical license couldn't be attacked. Or if a medical provider in Washington State provides care for, say, a trans youth in Idaho, that Idaho can't attack their Washington medical license through the interstate compact. So we're thinking a lot about these things that can be done. And I think hopefully in the next legislative session, we'll see some bills around these things. And I think the more that people in the public can speak to their legislators and tell them, like, Washington needs to be a safe place. It needs to be a haven where everybody can receive the care that they need, that their doctors have prescribed for them, that is medically appropriate, and that people should never have to live in fear for receiving care that, for me, it was life-saving care. I was extremely unwell and suicidal before, going through puberty was really traumatic for me. And receiving care in Boston was life-changing. I mean, it really opened up so much of like who I am and allowed me to be who I wanted to be, allowed me to go to college, allowed me to finish high school. It was life-changing. And I've seen that for so many trans young people that I've worked with like over the last 2.5 decades. And I think just holding that in our hearts and knowing that this care can be life-saving for people. And I think, Councilmember Morales said it is life-affirming care. It opens possibilities for people to have the life that they want to have, that they need to have, that they have a right to have. And so that's what I try to hold in my heart. And especially when speaking to lawmakers in the next session, that's what the message we'll be sending.
So yeah, another super powerful story, right? Like, I'm so grateful that you got that care, but at the same time, here is this caseworker, right, taking you 3.5 hours twice a month to get the care. And it's the same kinds of barriers that are being created right now. Absolutely. With these bans that are happening. And that's what we really have to have our eyes on and do everything that we can to interrupt that, right? And to allow people to get the care that they need. And so, Councilmember Morales, I'm going to come back to you because I feel like following in that same vein, right, of with all of the things that are happening, both the criminalization where that is or the bans, what would you like to see in this state? This is our home state in Washington state that we can do to expand access and to protect access.
Yeah, well, a lot of it has been discussed already. Our democracy, our civil liberties could very well experience further erosion because of the Supreme Court that we have right now. There is an upcoming test case on independent state legislature theory that could impact affirmative action, civil rights for LGBTQ people. There's plenty of opportunity for harm. And so passing progressive policy through our state legislatures is going to be even more crucial. And coming from Texas, as I do, the idea of, arguing for local control seems really weird to me. But, I think the number one thing, and the governor has already talked about this, is constitutional protections for access to abortion care and gender affirming care, the data privacy that Maru spoke about, particularly as it relates to the kinds of apps and information that is being gathered at these crisis pregnancy centers. That is potentially really dangerous to limiting crisis pregnancy centers. At the city level, we have passed legislation that kind of helps curb the misinformation that is promulgated from these kinds of centers. I think the state should take similar steps to make sure that that kind of misinformation is not allowed. We've talked about medical providers, making sure that providers from other states who are potentially facing prosecution for providing services have a safe place to be or are protected if they come here. But we're also facing a significant shortage of providers who perform abortion services. And so making sure that our state credential review provides exemption for those who have been prosecuted in another state if they're seeking licensure here, and also just making sure that we are including that training for medical providers. I think, normalizing abortion as healthcare starts with the medical profession, and requiring that kind of training as part of a medical school curriculum can help make sure that we have a pipeline of providers. The other thing that I think is really important, and we have been, Councilmember Herbold and I have been working with some folks at the state level for this next session on limiting hospital mergers and requiring better consumer information about the kinds of services that are provided at a hospital, particularly when hospital mergers with religious institutions have been, slowly eroding access because they don't provide that kind of care. So I think it is really time to regulate that practice and require that hospitals provide patients who, particularly those who are entering for reproductive services, with very clear information about whether or not they provide abortion services at the hospital. And then the last thing I'll say is that, here in Seattle, we just passed our budget. We did put in $1.25 million to help support abortion access for Seattleites, but also for folks who are coming from other states. And I do think that ensuring that those services are free for people who struggle to pay, particularly for folks who are not documented, is an important next step for us to take. So I'm hoping that we can get to a place where abortions are free for those who are seeking services in the state, and lots of work lined up for the legislature this session.
Indeed. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on that. And for those who've been wondering, why have I not called upon my dear own colleague, Leah? It's because there are so many questions coming from the audience that are good ones for her that I wanted to give her a little bit of time to be ready for that. So Leah, I am turning to you now and saying, given the continual attacks on bodily autonomy across the country, what is the state legislation we should expect to see this session in the reproductive rights and gender affirming care spaces? And then also, I'm just going to let you take on, there's a variety of questions in the chat that I know that you're paying attention to. So I'll let you address things as you see fit. Yeah.
Sure, thank you so much. So I think so much of what we will be advocating for this session and expect to see was articulated by Danny and Councilmember Morales. Thank you so much. I'll give like a snapshot of what I would call sort of 5 priorities that I think a lot of reproductive health, gender affirming advocates will be looking to see this session. And I kind of split them into, one's about protecting providers, patients, seekers, and one's about expanding and breaking down barriers to care. So the first one to articulate is the Washington My Health, My Data Act that was mentioned. As Mario explained, there are so many reasons we need to protect individuals' health data. And this bill would go such a long way to ensuring that data is not sold, that there are guardrails in place to the collection of sharing of data, and that there are certain prohibitions placed on geofencing. So we just think part of this legislative session, we want to see that advance and ideally pass as things move forward. Again, when we're talking about protections, the SHIELD law Danny mentioned is so important in the context of ensuring that when other states are trying to criminalize our providers, patients coming to our state, Washington needs to do what it can to protect people in the state. And people come here to access care. We can't do everything, right? These are other states' laws. There are limits on what we can do, but to the extent we can provide additional protections, we have to try to do that. A third piece of legislation we hope to see, and again, I think some of my wonderful colleagues here today touched upon it, is protections relating to provider licensing and medical malpractice insurance. We should not be dinging our providers here on their licenses because of actions that include providing legal abortion and reproductive abortion care and gender affirming care that are legal performed in Washington state. We need to ensure providers don't have those fears all the time. And we need to make sure their medical malpractice insurance is affordable, irrespective of whether they provide abortion and gender affirming care. I'm going to transition really quickly into breaking down barriers to care, because that is so key to this work. And even in Washington, there are barriers. To the good points, we have gotten so far because we have been fighting and lobbying and advocating, and we really have to continue doing that here. The 2 things I wanted to mention here are ending cost sharing for abortion care. No one should be unable to get the care they need because of expenses. People should be able to get healthcare. And so while we've passed some really great insurance laws in the context of abortion and in gender affirming care law, often there are still out-of-pocket costs, and we're trying to get rid of these. Lastly, I want to mention the Keep Our Care Act. We hope to pass this bill. We have seen in Washington state and around the country health entities merging and affiliating, and the council member really articulated this well, reducing access to affordable quality care in communities, including reproductive, gender affirming, and end-of-life care. And the Keep Our Care Act would address that. It would ensure a health entity merger could not move forward unless it would improve access to care rather than making it worse. So those, I think, are the 5 priorities that I'd highlight, along with funding, obviously, as things we really hope to see move forward this legislative session. I do want to very briefly respond to a few of these questions. I'll try to only do 1 or 2. So one that I saw was, can we have protections for miscarriage care? So I would highlight number 1 in Washington State. I think 2 years ago, we passed a bill, the Protecting Pregnant Patient Act, and it does exactly that. It ensures that a health entity cannot prohibit a provider from providing care to a pregnant person suffering pregnancy complications, miscarriages, etc. On the federal level, the Biden administration has issued guidance relating to the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. And that is an act that's been around, I think, since the 80s, that essentially says that if you come to the hospital in labor, a hospital can't just turn you away. They have to, at the very least, stabilize you, right? And the Biden administration, through its guidance, has tried to make clear this includes if you need to provide abortion care, because in many contexts, in the context of miscarriage, as I think this question gets to, that's the care that's needed. There was immediate pushback from the Attorney General in Texas on this and a lawsuit. And the Biden administration also sued Idaho about its law that it essentially violated, came in conflict with EMTALA. Texas was successful with their lawsuit so far in Texas, and the Biden administration was successful so far in Idaho. And so it is in a difficult place right now, though I will say that generally speaking, federal law is supreme as compared to state law. And so we would hope in many of these situations that the Biden guidance would be abided by and that people would get the care they need. Very briefly, I'll just see one right now and say, there is mention about the Reproductive Privacy Act and how there is a provision in it that says if you provide maternity care, you have to provide substantially equivalent abortion care. That is completely accurate. The ACLU sued on this in 2016 and had a really good decision. And then the Public Hospital District, eventually we reached a settlement and they began providing abortion care. I think the person who provided that question is absolutely correct. We need to be ensuring we have access across our state to this care, and rural areas are especially at risk. So just completely supportive of what that person was saying there. I'm going to pause for now. I know there are many other questions that if we have time, we can get to.
Right. Well, we don't actually have a lot of time because we are supposed to end here at 6 o'clock. I think something that I want to do, I want to give Courtney an opportunity to speak to additional abortion-related funding issues and about what opportunities are there. If you can kind of answer that quickly, right? There is clearly a real need for support for funding. So what are the things that you know about that might be available?
Thanks, Michelle. I mean, you're right, because our state can do all kinds of things to protect our rights, but if we don't actually have access, then those rights are not realized in our everyday lives, and we can't be there for the people coming to us from additional states. So we'll be asking the state legislature to support funding investments really to stabilize the safety net abortion providers by covering the care that's currently not compensated at cost. And in a given year for Cedar River clinics and Planned Parenthood affiliates in Washington, that comes to about $10.4 million if you also are factoring in the amounts expected in the increase of out-of-state patients. We also know that the Northwest Abortion Access Fund, which is an incredible organization that's been around for many years, serving our entire region, they have a request for $1 million because the number of inquiries and requests for support accessing abortion care has really skyrocketed. They are able to support folks with their travel and logistics needs, and have just been a really incredible benefit to our community in many states in the Northwest. Similarly, the Department of Health in the biennial budget has a request for the state to pass $28 million to cover the cost of assisting patients who are in need of abortion care. And that includes out-of-state patients, which makes me so proud of our state and really excited to help advocate for that at the Capitol this winter. We also, I talked about the workforce issues. We're requesting $11.8 million to help Washington make sure that the abortion provider workforce in Washington can be sustainable and thriving. It's fantastic to have access to care, but we need a great workforce who's available to provide that care. And lastly, we'll be asking for some support with security grants. We even just had a security issue today at our Seattle Madison Health Center. We see this all the time, and we're requesting some support for affiliates to be able to, upgrade some of the equipment and facilities that we're able to use to protect our health centers. And we know that for many queer, trans, and BIPOC-led organizations that are fighting for bodily autonomy in our communities every day, they're not always able to be at the Capitol advocating for their communities. And so we are on the lookout for any requests that they may make for any key resources that they're in need of, and we would be excited to support those as well. So I have to kind of speed through that, but I hope that gives a glimpse of it.
No, that is an important glimpse. And so I know we need to wrap up. I want to give Leah the chance. So we, as I said before, right, everybody here on this panel, they're working double, triple, quadruple time to really support immigrant communities and queer communities and just everyone around getting all these kinds of healthcare that have been at risk. And so the question, of course, is like, well, what can anybody do? And I want to give Leah a chance to speak to that before I close out. Just what can people do to stay involved and to help out this legislative session? And then I'll close us out. And thank you, everyone, for staying a little bit over.
So thank you to everyone who wants to get involved. We are so appreciative. First and foremost, all those links of all the organizations we sent you, they are going to be doing the work this session, and they are going to have ways to keep you updated. ACLU does action alerts. Many of these other organizations are going to do similar things. So get on their listservs, stalk their websites to make sure you know what's going on from time to time, because that is a great way to get involved, because they're tracking when all the hearings are. They're letting you know when there needs to be sign-on letters, what the key bills to be watching are. Really can't emphasize enough that that's a great resource. I will say we also have in the chat, ACLU has put together an initial webpage that sort of highlights those 5 priorities I had mentioned that many other people had mentioned today as well. If you want to go there, we have included a petition that you can sign on in support of reproductive and gender affirming care this session. Also an email that you can send to your friends and family to say, get involved in this work, and here's this webpage, as well as a couple of resources for additional information. As we get nearer and nearer to session, all our organizations are going to have those type of materials available for everyone. So please keep in touch. Also, to the extent you feel passionately or strongly about any of this, contact your lawmaker. They are so sick of hearing from the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and everyone else. And it means so much and gets so much further in many ways if they hear from their constituents. So if you feel strongly about these issues, please reach out to your lawmaker and let them know. Thank you so much.
That's perfect. That's a perfect way for us to wind down. So I just want to express my gratitude to everyone on the panel for the work that you do in the community and for you taking time, in spite of all that, which I know, again, triple, quadruple overtime, to spend some time sharing with folks tonight about what's going on, what we're seeing on the ground, and what we can all do to have a more just and humane state and country for all people, regardless of their identities. At the end of the day, it's it's the issue, the private issue between a person and a healthcare provider. At the end of the day, it's about human dignity in your bodily autonomy, in your freedom, the thing that we have claim to promise and need to realize upon, that justice should be for all and freedom should be for all. And this is one of those spaces in which that needs to happen. So thank you to Maru, to Danny, to Councilmember Morales, to Courtney, to Dr. Chin, and to Leah for all that you're doing. We are going to go forward fighting for all of our rights, because going back just is not an option. So again, thank you, all of you who came to listen today and who stuck it out all the way to the end. I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.